The year 1221 stands as a watershed moment in military history, marking the full maturation of psychological warfare as a deliberate, systematic instrument of conquest. By this year, the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan had transformed terror from a mere consequence of war into a precise, calculated weapon that would reshape the nature of conflict for centuries to come. The Mongol approach to fear was neither random savagery nor uncontrolled brutality, but rather a sophisticated methodology that turned psychological dominance into an exact science, as refined and purposeful as their revolutionary cavalry tactics or their innovative siege warfare techniques. The strategic context of 1221. To comprehend how fear became weaponized so effectively by 1221, we must first understand the geopolitical landscape confronting the Mongol forces. The empire had already conquered vast territories across Central Asia, and by this pivotal year, Genghis Khan was deep into his campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire, one of the most formidable Islamic states of the medieval period. The Khwarezmian Shah Muhammad II had committed the catastrophic error of executing Mongol envoys in 1218, an insult that demanded absolute retribution according to Mongol diplomatic custom and the inviolable traditions governing ambassadorial immunity throughout the medieval world. The campaign that unfolded would demonstrate the complete systematization of psychological warfare tactics that had been developing incrementally throughout previous Mongol conquests. Cities including Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench, and Nishapur had already fallen, or were falling. But 1221 witnessed the perfection of terror tactics into a comprehensive, replicable system. The Mongols were not merely seizing territory through military superiority. They were engineering the psychological collapse of enemy resistance before their armies even approached city walls. This represented a fundamental revolution in military thinking that would influence warfare through the modern era. The multi-layered architecture of terror. The Mongol strategy of fear operated simultaneously on multiple interconnected levels, each component reinforcing the others to create a comprehensive system of psychological dominance that was unprecedented in its sophistication and effectiveness. At the foundation lay meticulous information control and manipulation. The Mongols maintained an extensive intelligence network that gathered extraordinarily detailed information about target cities and kingdoms long before their armies appeared on the horizon. This intelligence apparatus, which relied upon merchants, travelers, captured prisoners, defectors, and embedded spies, allowed them to understand intimately the political structures, military capabilities, economic vulnerabilities, and psychological weaknesses of their enemies. Once this information was systematically gathered and analyzed, the Mongols carefully controlled the flow of information about their own capabilities, intentions, and movements. They deliberately cultivated an aura of invincibility and supernatural power that transcended mere military reputation. Stories of Mongol atrocities were not suppressed or denied, but rather allowed to spread organically, and in certain calculated cases actively encouraged through the selective release of survivors who would carry tales of horror to neighboring regions. The Mongols understood intuitively what modern psychological warfare experts would later codify: that reputation could accomplish what tens of thousands of soldiers could not achieve through force alone. The complete demoralization and paralysis of enemy populations before the first arrow flew or the first sword was drawn. The strategy also involved extraordinarily careful calibration of violence along a calculated spectrum. The Mongols did not indiscriminately slaughter every population they encountered, despite their fearsome reputation. Instead, they created a stark binary choice system that was communicated with perfect clarity to their targets through embassies, proclamations, and the demonstrable pattern of their actions. Immediate, unconditional surrender meant survival and relatively lenient treatment under Mongol administration, while resistance of any kind meant total, systematic annihilation without mercy or exception. This binary was not merely rhetorical posturing or empty threat. The Mongols demonstrated their absolute willingness to follow through on both promises with unwavering consistency that gave their ultimatums terrifying credibility. Cities that surrendered promptly were typically spared wholesale slaughter, though they still faced substantial tribute demands, conscription of artisans and skilled workers for relocation to other parts of the empire, military levies, and incorporation into the Mongol administrative and taxation system. Cities that resisted, however, faced methodical destruction that served as deliberate object lessons to other potential resistors throughout the region and beyond. The massacre at Nishapur in 1221, where the entire population was reportedly killed in calculated retaliation for the death of Genghis Khan's favored son-in-law, Tokuchar, during the siege, exemplified this principle with horrifying clarity. Whether the astronomical numbers reported by medieval chroniclers, some claiming over 1 million dead, were mathematically accurate or substantially exaggerated matters less than the undeniable fact that the story spread like wildfire throughout the Islamic world, creating paralyzing fear in cities yet untouched by Mongol forces and fundamentally altering strategic calculations from Persia to Syria. The sophisticated mechanics of psychological warfare. The Mongol approach to psychological warfare in 1221 demonstrated remarkable sophistication in its execution, revealing a deep understanding of human psychology that seems almost modern in its systematic application. One particularly ingenious element was the deliberate use of refugees as unwitting weapons of war. When a city fell after offering resistance, the Mongols would typically allow a carefully selected portion of survivors to flee rather than completing the slaughter. These traumatized refugees would stream into neighboring cities and regions, bringing with them vivid, horrific tales of Mongol cruelty, military prowess, and the futility of resistance. This served multiple interconnected strategic purposes. It profoundly demoralized populations in cities not yet attacked, creating defeatism and internal political divisions. It severely strained the economic and logistical resources of those recipient cities as they absorbed waves of desperate refugees. And it created intense internal political conflicts as debates raged within city walls over whether to surrender preemptively or prepare for resistance, often paralyzing effective decision-making until it was too late. The Mongols also employed visual terror with calculated precision that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of symbolic communication. When cities were destroyed after resistance, the destruction was made deliberately visible and memorable through carefully staged atrocities. Pyramids constructed from the skulls of the slain were erected outside ruined cities, serving as permanent monuments to the terrible cost of defiance. These gruesome displays were not random acts of bloodlust or uncontrolled savagery, but rather deliberately staged spectacles designed to communicate an unmistakable message to anyone who passed by. This is the inevitable fate awaiting those who defy Mongol demands. The visual impact of these monuments was carefully calculated to create lasting psychological trauma and to serve as constant reminders that transcended linguistic and cultural boundaries. The timing and sequence of Mongol attacks were also carefully orchestrated for maximum psychological effect rather than following conventional military logic. The Mongols would often attack the strongest, most prestigious, and best defended cities first, rather than following the typical military wisdom of gradually building momentum by picking off weaker targets initially. By destroying powerful, well-defended cities like Bukhara and Samarkand early in a regional campaign, often in mere days rather than the months or years that contemporary siege warfare typically required, they comprehensively shattered the confidence and morale of lesser cities and kingdoms throughout the region. If mighty Samarkand, with its formidable walls and large garrison, could fall so quickly, what realistic hope did smaller, less well-defended cities possess? This strategy deliberately inverted traditional siege warfare logic and created cascading waves of despair throughout enemy territories that often achieved strategic objectives without further fighting. Communication itself became another crucial element of the comprehensive psychological strategy. The Mongols were absolute masters of the strategic ultimatum, and their demands were carefully crafted to maximize psychological pressure while providing clear behavioral pathways for their enemies. They would dispatch embassies to cities demanding immediate surrender. But these embassies were far more than simple diplomatic missions requesting submission. They were carefully choreographed theatrical performances designed to intimidate, demoralize, and psychologically prepare populations for conquest. The Mongol emissaries would detail with disturbing specificity exactly what would happen if the city chose to resist, painting extraordinarily vivid pictures of the destruction, slaughter, and suffering to come, while simultaneously offering the tangible possibility of survival, continuity, and relative prosperity through immediate capitulation and cooperation with Mongol administration. The revolutionary speed factor. Central to the Mongol strategy of fear was their unprecedented mobility and tempo of operations, which exceeded anything previously seen in medieval warfare. Mongol armies could move faster and cover far greater distances than any contemporary military force, and they exploited this dramatic advantage not merely for tactical surprise on the battlefield, but for profound psychological destabilization of entire regions. The apparent ability of Mongol forces to appear simultaneously in multiple widely separated locations created a pervasive impression of omnipresence that amplified fear far beyond what their actual numerical strength justified, making the empire seem vastly larger and more powerful than it actually was. In 1221, during the relentless pursuit of the fleeing Shah Muhammad II, Mongol forces under the brilliant generals Jebe and Subutai demonstrated this principle with devastating effectiveness. They pursued the terrified Shah across Persia, through the treacherous Caucasus Mountains, and deep into southern Russia, covering thousands of miles at speeds that seemed physically impossible to contemporary observers and chroniclers. This implacable pursuit served multiple interconnected strategic purposes. It eliminated a potential rallying point for organized resistance, while simultaneously demonstrating to all potential enemies throughout the known world that there was no escape from Mongol retribution, no matter how far one fled or how difficult the terrain. The message was unmistakable. Defiance would be punished regardless of distance, difficulty, or time required. The extraordinary speed of Mongol military operations also dramatically compressed the decision-making time available to enemy commanders, rulers, and city councils. Traditional medieval warfare typically involved lengthy sieges lasting months or years, and extended campaigns that allowed ample time for diplomatic maneuvering, alliance formation, strategic planning, and the marshaling of resources and reinforcements. The Mongols deliberately denied their enemies this crucial temporal breathing space. Cities would suddenly find Mongol armies encamped at their gates with demands for immediate, unconditional surrender, forcing panicked decisions made under extreme duress that consistently played into Mongol strategic objectives and prevented rational, coordinated responses. This temporal compression proved particularly effective because it systematically prevented enemy coalitions from forming and coordinating their resistance. By the time one city's rulers realized they desperately needed external assistance, neighboring cities were already under direct attack or had been completely destroyed. The Mongols moved through enemy territories like a catastrophic flash flood, overwhelming defenses and shattering resistance before organized, coordinated opposition could coalesce across regions. This speed transformed fear from a static emotion into a dynamic, spreading panic that raced ahead of Mongol armies like a psychological shockwave, accomplishing much of their strategic work before physical combat was even joined. Intelligence supremacy and systematic deception. The Mongol mastery of fear in 1221 was fundamentally built upon perhaps the most sophisticated and far-reaching intelligence apparatus of the entire medieval world. Long before Mongol armies appeared on any horizon, their intelligence network had already thoroughly penetrated target societies, systematically gathering comprehensive information about everything from precise military capabilities and troop dispositions to internal political factions and rivalries, from detailed maps of trade routes to the locations of water sources and food supplies. This dramatic information asymmetry gave the Mongols an enormous psychological advantage that compounded their military superiority. They knew their enemies intimately in all their vulnerabilities and weaknesses, while their enemies knew almost nothing reliable about them beyond terrifying rumors and fragmentary reports from traumatized survivors. The Mongols also practiced systematic, sophisticated deception to amplify fear and create confusion among their enemies. They would deliberately exaggerate the size of their armies through various ingenious means, spreading carefully crafted rumors through merchants and travelers, using multiple banners and standards to suggest more units than actually existed, lighting excessive numbers of campfires at night to suggest vast encampments, and moving cavalry units rapidly between locations to create the impression of much larger forces operating simultaneously across wide areas. Contemporary chroniclers from both Islamic and Christian sources consistently reported Mongol armies as being far larger than they actually were, often by factors of 2, 3, or even 5. A compelling testament to the extraordinary effectiveness of these systematic deception tactics in creating psychological impact. Disinformation campaigns constituted another sophisticated tool in the Mongol psychological arsenal. The Mongols would deliberately plant false information about their strategic intentions and operational plans, causing enemy forces to misallocate their defensive resources or make catastrophically poor strategic decisions based on faulty intelligence that the Mongols had carefully fed them. They would feign disorganized retreats to draw overconfident enemies into devastating ambushes where they could be surrounded and destroyed. They would spread elaborate rumors of internal dissension, leadership disputes, or logistical weaknesses to encourage premature attacks that played directly into Mongol tactical advantages and allowed them to engage enemies on favorable ground and terms of their own choosing. The extensive intelligence network also allowed the Mongols to identify and systematically exploit internal divisions, resentments, and conflicts within enemy societies with remarkable precision. They would reach out to disaffected nobles nursing grievances, oppressed religious minorities seeking protection, or rival political factions hungry for power, offering them considerably better treatment, religious tolerance, administrative positions, or political advantages in exchange for cooperation, intelligence, or simply passive acceptance of Mongol conquest. This sophisticated strategy of divide and conquer was powerfully enhanced by the Mongols' terrifying reputation. The overwhelming fear of what might happen if the Mongols were not appeased or cooperated with made some factions genuinely willing to betray their own traditional rulers in desperate hopes of obtaining mercy and favorable treatment under the new order. The ritual dimensions of terror. The Mongol weaponization of fear also deliberately incorporated powerful elements of ritual and spectacle that gave their terror tactics a quasi-religious dimension that resonated deeply with medieval mentalities. The Mongols understood intuitively that fear operates not only on a rational, calculated level, but also on much deeper, more primal psychological and spiritual planes. By incorporating unmistakably ritualistic elements into their systematic violence, they effectively tapped into fundamental human anxieties about chaos, divine punishment, cosmic justice, and supernatural forces beyond human control or comprehension. The highly systematic nature of Mongol atrocities in cities that had chosen resistance served a powerful ritual function that transcended mere military necessity. The slaughter was not chaotic, random, or disorganized, but rather proceeded according to established, predictable patterns that gave it an air of terrible inevitability and cosmic necessity. This deliberate ritualization of violence made it seem less like the opportunistic cruelty of common bandits or undisciplined soldiers, and more like the inexorable working out of divine justice or heavenly judgment against the wicked or faithless. The Mongols actively encouraged this interpretation among conquered peoples, positioning themselves as instruments of heaven's will sent to punish the unjust, the corrupt, or those who had violated sacred laws. The pyramids of skulls and other carefully constructed monuments of death served not merely as practical warnings to potential resistors, but as sacred markers that transformed the physical landscape itself into a readable text communicating Mongol power. These monuments declared that Mongol victory was not temporary or reversible, but permanent and metaphysically ordained, not merely military conquest, but cosmic reordering. They transformed geography into psychology, making the land itself a carrier and constant reminder of terror that would persist long after Mongol armies had moved on to other conquests. Public executions of rulers and military leaders who had chosen resistance were also carefully staged as elaborate spectacles loaded with symbolic meaning. These executions were designed not merely to eliminate leadership, but to demonstrate viscerally the utter futility of resistance and the terrible, inevitable price of defiance. The manner of execution would sometimes be deliberately chosen to maximize ritual humiliation and horror, such as execution without shedding blood, considered by Mongols to show respect but perceived by victims as particularly terrifying, ensuring that the story would be endlessly retold and would serve as a powerful deterrent to any contemplating future resistance. Strategic mercy as psychological weapon. Perhaps the single most sophisticated aspect of the comprehensive Mongol strategy of fear was their calculated, systematic use of mercy as a weapon equally powerful as terror. The Mongol system of psychological warfare would have been far less effective, perhaps even counterproductive, if they had simply killed everyone they encountered, regardless of behavior. Instead, they created and consistently maintained a crystal-clear path to survival. Immediate, unconditional surrender before resistance began. This stark binary choice was communicated with perfect clarity through embassies, proclamations, and above all, through the absolutely consistent pattern of Mongol actions, and this consistency made it predictable, and predictability made it effective as a decision-making framework that enemy rulers and populations could rely upon when making the most crucial choice they would ever face. Cities that surrendered immediately and completely were generally treated with considerable restraint by the brutal standards of medieval warfare. The population would be spared wholesale slaughter, though they would have to accept Mongol overlordship without question, pay substantial regular tribute in goods and precious metals, and provide soldiers for future campaigns or skilled artisans for relocation to other parts of the vast empire where their skills were needed. This relatively lenient treatment of populations that surrendered immediately served a crucial psychological function that was central to the entire system. It validated and proved the Mongol promise that surrender genuinely meant survival and continuity. If the Mongols had treated surrendered cities with the same systematic brutality they inflicted on resistant ones, their entire sophisticated psychological strategy would have collapsed immediately, as there would be no rational incentive to surrender rather than fight to the death. The Mongols also demonstrated selective mercy in other calculated ways that enhanced their psychological dominance and practical control. They would systematically spare skilled artisans, experienced administrators, literate scholars, and influential religious figures who could prove useful to the empire, often relocating them to distant parts of the Mongol domains where their expertise was most needed. This practice served multiple interconnected strategic purposes. It prevented the tragic loss of valuable human capital and specialized knowledge. It demonstrated clearly that the Mongols valued competence, skill, and practical utility over ethnic or religious identity. And it created a substantial class of survivors who owed their very lives to Mongol mercy and might therefore become genuinely loyal servants of the new order, rather than resentful subjects awaiting opportunity for revenge. Religious tolerance, while genuine to a significant degree, and rooted in Mongol shamanic traditions that respected all paths to the divine, also served important psychological and political purposes. By sparing religious institutions and showing conspicuous respect for various faiths, including Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, and others, the Mongols effectively prevented the formation of united religious resistance movements and gained the cooperation of religious leaders who could powerfully influence their followers to accept Mongol rule as divinely ordained or at least tolerable. This was particularly crucial in the Islamic world, where religious authority and scholarly opinion carried enormous weight in shaping public opinion, political legitimacy, and the moral acceptability of cooperation with non-Muslim rulers. The self-amplifying effect of reputation. By 1221, the carefully constructed Mongol strategy of fear had created what might be termed a self-amplifying or viral effect, where fear multiplied and spread itself through social, cultural, and psychological mechanisms that required minimal direct Mongol intervention or input. Stories of Mongol military prowess and systematic atrocities spread far beyond the actual reach of Mongol armies, creating paralyzing terror in distant regions that had never been directly threatened and might never face actual invasion. Medieval chroniclers, writing in Arabic, Persian, Georgian, Russian, and eventually Latin, recorded increasingly fantastical and embellished accounts of Mongol capabilities and cruelty. And while these accounts were often wildly exaggerated or incorporated supernatural elements, their exaggeration paradoxically served Mongol strategic interests by making the empire seem even more powerful, numerous, and terrifying than it actually was. This amplification effect meant that the Mongols were effectively fighting on two distinct but interconnected battlefields simultaneously: the physical battlefield where cavalry charged and arrows flew, and the psychological battlefield where narratives, reputations, and collective fears determined outcomes before soldiers ever engaged in direct combat. In numerous cases throughout 1221 and subsequent years, the psychological battlefield proved decisively more important than physical combat. Cities would surrender without resistance, armies would disintegrate or mutiny before contact with Mongol forces, and rulers would flee their realms rather than attempt to organize coherent defense, all because the fear generated by Mongol reputation had already achieved complete psychological victory before military operations even began. The amplification effect was substantially enhanced by the Mongols' systematic practice of incorporating conquered peoples and their military forces into subsequent Mongol armies. Conscripted soldiers from one conquered region would participate directly in the conquest of the next target, spreading first-hand accounts of Mongol military prowess, tactical sophistication, and absolute ruthlessness toward resistance. These impressed soldiers served as highly effective vectors for fear, carrying the virus of terror into new territories where their testimony carried special weight. Their accounts were particularly psychologically effective because they came from people who had personally experienced Mongol power and had no apparent reason to exaggerate Mongol capabilities. Indeed, they had every incentive to minimize them to avoid appearing cowardly for having submitted. The complete integration of fear into military culture. What ultimately made the Mongol weaponization of fear so devastatingly effective was its complete, seamless integration into their broader military culture, tactical doctrine, and organizational systems. Fear was not treated as a supplementary tool or optional addition to military operations, but rather as a fundamental, essential component of their entire way of war that was as important as horses, bows, or discipline. Every aspect of Mongol military organization, from their revolutionary emphasis on strategic mobility, to their absolute mastery of mounted archery, to their sophisticated command and control systems utilizing flags and messengers, reinforced and was reinforced by their psychological warfare strategies in a comprehensive, mutually supporting system. The Mongol organizational structure itself contributed substantially to their fearsome reputation and battlefield effectiveness. Their innovative decimal system of military organization, with precisely defined units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, warriors allowed for remarkable coordination, flexibility, and control across vast distances. This organizational sophistication meant that Mongol armies could execute extraordinarily complex maneuvers and coordinated attacks across multiple axes that seemed impossible to their enemies, further enhancing the aura of invincibility and supernatural capability surrounding Mongol forces and creating the impression that they possessed almost superhuman discipline and coordination. Mongol tactical innovations also served powerful psychological purposes beyond their immediate battlefield effectiveness. Their famous feigned retreat tactic, where cavalry would appear to flee in complete disorder only to wheel suddenly and counterattack when overconfident enemies broke formation in pursuit, was particularly effective at generating panic and destroying morale. Armies that fell victim to this tactic even once would become profoundly hesitant to pursue any fleeing Mongol forces in future engagements, dramatically reducing their battlefield effectiveness and creating psychological uncertainty and second-guessing among commanders that the Mongols could ruthlessly exploit. The sophisticated integration of different types of military units in Mongol armies also contributed significantly to their psychological dominance. Heavy cavalry, light cavalry, siege engineers with advanced technology, and infantry units, including impressed local forces, worked together seamlessly in combined arms operations, allowing the Mongols to adapt to radically different tactical situations without losing momentum or effectiveness. This extraordinary flexibility meant that enemies could never be certain what approach the Mongols would employ, creating pervasive strategic uncertainty that compounded existing fear and made effective defensive planning nearly impossible. Conclusion. The enduring legacy of 1221. The year 1221 represents not the initial invention of Mongol psychological warfare, but rather its perfection, systematization, and deployment at maximum effectiveness. By this pivotal point in Genghis Khan's world-transforming conquests, fear had been deliberately transformed from a natural human emotion into a weapon as deadly and strategically decisive as the legendary Mongol composite bow. The systematic, calculated application of terror tactics, combined with genuine military excellence and revolutionary tactical innovations, created a powerful synergy that made the Mongol military machine nearly unstoppable at its peak and allowed a relatively small nomadic population to conquer much of the known world. The profound long-term impact of the Mongol strategy of fear extended far beyond immediate military conquests and territorial expansion. It fundamentally influenced military thinking for centuries afterward, demonstrating to future commanders across cultures the immense power of psychological warfare when systematically applied as an integral component of military operations. The Mongol example proved definitively that terror could be weaponized effectively, that fear could be deliberately engineered and controlled, and that psychological dominance could achieve crucial strategic objectives that would require vastly greater resources and casualties to accomplish through conventional military means alone. The weaponization of fear by the Mongols in 1221 represents one of the most sophisticated and effective applications of psychological warfare in all of pre-modern military history, and its lessons remain disturbingly relevant in contemporary conflict.